Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this book talk of Continental Philosophy of Technoscience by Zwart. We're very delighted to have Hub here with us. So this event is organized by the Research Network for Philosophy and Technology, led by Juchniewicz. So today we have our moderator, Pieter Lemmens, who is assistant professor at Radboud University and who will be leading the discussion with two guest speakers who will respond to Hope's talk. So welcome, Pieter. And he
Thank
will
you, Ashley, and thanks a lot. Yeah, welcome to all of you. My name is Pieter Lemmens, and I'm a philosopher of technology affiliated to both the Institute of Science and Society at Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and to the Research Network of Philosophy and Technology, which has organized this event, as Ashley already said. We are very happy today to have Professor Zwart as our guest to present his recently published book entitled Continental Philosophy of Technoscience, which appeared last year in November with Springer Press. Professor Zwart, who was the former chair of the Department of Philosophy at Radboud University, is now Dean of the Erasmus School of Philosophy at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He has published 15 books and more than 100 academic papers on a great variety of philosophical topics. And the focus of his current research is on philosophical and ethical issues in the emerging life sciences, with an emphasis on genomics and post-genomics fields, such as synthetic biology, nanomedicine, and brain research. He's also interested in research integrity and academic authorship, with a special attention given to the use of genres of the imagination in research and education, such as novels, plays, and poetry. And his latest philosophical work has consisted partly in developing a continental philosophical perspective on contemporary technoscience, with special attention to the life sciences. And this has resulted in the book that we will present this afternoon. And this book is foremost directed at philosophy students and early stage researchers, helping them to become practicing and not only theorizing philosophers in technoscientific settings. And the focus is on the methodological issue of how to practice continental philosophy of technoscience today, drawing upon various continental thinkers such as Hegel, Engels, Heidegger, Bachelard and Lacan, and their fields of dialectics, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis, in developing a coherent message around the technicity of science, or rather technoscience. As already said, the focus lies on recent developments in life science research, such as genomics, post-genomics, synthetic biology, and global ecology. And the book uniquely presents continental perspectives that tend to be underrepresented in mainstream philosophy of science, yet entail crucial insights for coming to terms with technoscience as it is evolving on a global scale today. Professor Zwart will start off this afternoon with a presentation of his book of about 45 minutes. After this presentation, we will give the floor to two respondents who will each give their impression of the book in about 20 minutes. And for that, we are also very happy to have as our guest Dr. Natalia Juchniewicz, who is an assistant professor from the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw in Poland, and our friend Dr. Vincent Blok, who is an associate professor at the Philosophy Chair Group of Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Natalia's work focuses on philosophy on technology, social philosophy, ethics, mobility study, sociology of new media, and she has published, among other things, on Hegelian dialectics and technology. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why we have invited her specifically. Vincent has great expertise in a great variety of subjects and has published 4 books, his last 2 being on Heidegger's philosophical method and on a new philosophical ecology, respectively. He has worked mostly on recently on the philosophy of technology in relation to ecology, on responsible research and innovation, and on the bioeconomy. We again welcome both also in our midst. After the talks of Natalia and Vincent, we will give Hugh the opportunity for a brief response, and then we will open the floor to the audience for a plenary Q&A. If you have questions, please ask them in either the Q&A window or in the chat box, which you can do already during the presentation. And I will be moderating the discussion. Without further ado, let's start with Huub's presentation. So Huub, the floor is yours. And I think you have a PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely honored to be here, and I look very much forward to the discussion, of course. But I'm also very happy to present my summary. Although Pieter, you gave an excellent summary of the objectives of the book already. Thank you for that. Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint slide? Okay. And without further ado, to quote Pieter, I'll kick off with my presentation. So once again, I'm very honored to present my book. And I would like to start with a, let's say, an autobiographical note, if I may call it like that. When I dived into philosophy in the 1980s, very long ago, philosophy was a kind of, well, divided field and divided subject, and to some extent it still is. On the one hand, I went to Nijmegen in the Netherlands to study continental philosophy. Basically, that meant author studies, Hegel, Aristotle, etc. And on the other hand, during the late 1980s, something new emerged, applied ethics, which seemed a completely different world. On one hand, let's say continental philosophers tended to say, well, applied ethics, that's not really philosophy, while the applied ethicists would say, well, continental philosophy, that's a burden, that's irrelevant, we no longer need that. Well, my career, so to speak, has been one big effort to try to mutually expose these two discourses and practices to one another, because I've always believed that, first of all, continental philosophy has something to say about contemporary science and technology, and has something to learn from contemporary developments, while on the other hand, diving into case studies, into concrete challenges can be a very important experience. So how to supersede, so to speak, how to move beyond this divide. So on the one hand, I was, as a student, exposed already to these big oeuvres, and I'm still very much engaged in reading them and trying to enter into a dialogue with these big names and big authors. And on the other hand, I became very much involved in all kinds of technoscientific projects, focusing on genomics, sequencing genomes, or building synthetic cells, or opening up windows into our brain. Well, all kinds of very fascinating technoscientific projects, which at the same time raised many philosophical questions and philosophical challenges. And my question has always been, and that's also basically the question of the book indeed, how to address these challenges, these sometimes very disruptive developments, sometimes very fascinating developments, how to address them, how to come to terms with them from a continental philosophical perspective. So on the one hand, I noticed from the very beginning that in, let's say, traditional philosophy of science or traditional bioethics, continental approaches, such as dialectics or phenomenology, tend to be underrepresented. Partly it's their own fault, so to speak, because their focus is on author studies, which is important. I don't deny that, of course. I'm in author studies as well myself. But at the same time, as I already indicated, I especially learn a lot from this mutual exposure, this mutual confrontation between, on the one hand, continental philosophy as it is still evolving, and on the other hand, developments in contemporary technoscience, how to bring them closer together. Because criticizing philosophy, criticizing technology, in general terms, that's important, but how to make this more precise and more concrete. And that's the ambition of my book, more or less. Well, what is continental philosophy? Very briefly, because you're all aware familiar with the phenomenon, of course. But for me, what is important is, for example, science is not our only source of information. Political action or art are also very important. Science is part of the zeitgeist. It's an historical phenomenon. It's a discourse, but also a practice, very important. It's a performative practice, very often a disruptive practice. And philosophy should develop a diagnostic of the present and a prognostic of the future about what is happening to our world under the sway of technoscience. I think there is a general conviction in continental philosophy that we are facing an epoch of profound disruption, and technoscience plays an important role in that, creating that disruption and at the same time trying to come to terms with it somehow. And the question is, how can, well, we as philosophers actively contribute, not only in terms of diagnostics, but also in terms of, well, trying to intervene, trying to move things in another direction. That's basically my ambition and my reason for participating in some of these technoscientific projects, where I play the role of the critical philosopher, the critical friend, so to speak. But I'll come back to that later. So yes, and Pieter already mentioned it. I'm very intrigued by the question of methodology. What I want to learn from authors like Hegel or Lacan or Heidegger is how to practice philosophy now, today. It's fascinating to read these authors, and it's fascinating how Hegel practiced philosophy in the early 19th century, but how to be a dialectical thinker now, how to do phenomenology or psychoanalysis now. And that's basically my question in my book. And it's a kind of summary of experiences, of my experiences while participating in a series of technoscientific projects as a continental philosopher. So roughly, these are my three sources of inspiration: dialectics, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis. But of course, there are many interconnections. Hegel himself grounded modern dialectics, but he wrote a book called Phenomenology, as you all know. Bachelard is a phenomenologist, but also published a lot of books with the title Psychoanalysis in it. Lacan, well, is a psychoanalyst, of course, building on Freud, but also on Hegel. And so these three sources of inspiration are interconnected in many ways. For me, they are part of one big, well, philosophical practice. If you look at science, what is interesting is that while my sources of inspiration, well, initially were all male, today in science, many women play a very important role. And it's very fascinating and interesting to read their biographies and autobiographies and to see what is happening in science. I call science technoscience. I know this is a controversial term, but I use this term because I want to explain, and well, my sources of inspiration were all convinced about that as well, Hegel, Heidegger, etc., that we shouldn't see technology as an application, so to speak, of science. Rather, it's the other way around. Science itself is inherently technological. Science is a technological endeavor. Science is producing new technologies all the time, not only in terms of applications, but in terms to do research. It's a very technical way of interacting with nature, of interacting with the world. Science is about thinking, but especially also about doing. It's very performative, it's very technological, it's very high tech. And that's why I use the term technoscience. One of the things I try to achieve in my work is proximity. So I don't want to study science from a distance. I don't believe in let's say a very abstract analysis, a pathos of distance, so to speak. I believe in a pathos of proximity. I want to enter into a dialogue. I want to understand what scientists are doing. I want to understand their desire to know, their will to know. And that's why I want to enter their laboratories, so to speak, and their buildings and their projects to have these dialogues. So what I do is not philosophy of science, but philosophy in science, as I tend to explain my work. So Nachbarschaft, to use a Heideggerian term, although he used it to talk about philosophy and art, but I use this term to talk about philosophy and science. Well, we travel together, but of course my perspective is slightly different, and for that I use the term oblique perspective, which I took from a very important dialectical thinker, Thomas Aquinas, who said, well, normal human understanding is focused on the object, the intentio recta, a subject studies an object. And the perspective of philosophy is tilted, it's oblique. You look at the interaction between the scientist and her or his object, so to speak, between the research team and the research target. And this interaction is the focus of this intentio obliqua. And of course, well, Thomas Aquinas also was a very important dialectical thinker. If you read his work, you always see this dialectical procedure, this dialectical methodology. He was a very methodological thinker. You start with an initial position, an initial concept, an initial assessment, so to speak. That will be challenged in various ways. You organize, so to speak, contradiction, antithesis, if you like, refutation. It's almost like a philosophical experiment, so to speak. And in the end, you will be able, hopefully, to bring these moments, bring these experiences together, to reconnect them, recombine them at a higher level of comprehension. That's the idea. That's the basic dialectical scheme, method, if you like. But of course, the most important philosophical thinker of modernity, I guess, is Hegel. But in his work, you find this same oblique perspective. In the phenomenology of the spirit, he explains quite clearly, I would say, that whereas science is about understanding nature and knowing a natural entity, natural object, a cell or a molecule or a biological system, although Hegel may not have used those terms, philosophy is about understanding scientific understanding, so to speak, knowing about knowing, analyzing how science evolves, the journey of scientific consciousness towards valid knowledge, passing through a series of configurations. And that's basically what the phenomenology of the spirit is about. And following science in its historical dialectical development towards a more comprehensive perspective. So science for philosophy is the phenomenon which we study, and science is acquiring important experiences, and the task, the assignment of philosophy is to reflect on those scientific experiences, their strengths and their shortnesses, and their weaknesses and their deficits from both perspectives, so to speak. And of course, Hegel well, has designed his famous dialectical method, which I think is quite similar to that of Thomas Aquinas. And you start with your primary concept, the first moment, M1, so to speak, in shorthand. This is confronted with all kinds of contradictions. There is a lot of differentiation. That's also, let's say, a historical process. Differentiations between various perspectives, differentiation, for example, between philosophy and science. They go each other's way, they go their own way, even, well, enter into a antithetical, contradictory, polemical relationship with each other. But in the end, we have to supersede this, we have to overcome this, and enter this third position, this position of reconciliation or reconvergence, the negation of the negation, where we overcome this contradiction and have learned a lot, hopefully. So, for example, and that's just one example, if you look at the history of science, for example, you start with a more holistic understanding, a worldview. This worldview is challenged by more precise and more differentiated forms of knowledge. They go their own way, there is divergence, so to speak. But in the end, all these movements, especially philosophy and science, try to, well, meet again at a certain point in a certain way. And in that respect, you can refer, for example, to contemporary efforts towards transdisciplinarity, and my ideal of philosophy in science that also tries to contribute to that. Of course, this is a very simplistic version of the scheme. It's more elaborate, it's more nuanced, but that's what I try to explain in my book. And this is one example from my own research. That's how I see the life sciences from a dialectical perspective. You start with a more holistic approach. You start with a phenomenon as a whole. Let's say a living organism, a gestalt, a tree, for example. And then the negativity of science, the moment of negation, sets in. Various scientific subdisciplines develop very technological ways of interacting with this object, which basically means taking it apart, reducing it to elementary components, so that in the end you have lost your organism, you have lost your living thing, because you end up with a genome sequence or with biomolecules or something like that. And then the third step is how to bring all these pieces, all these fragments together again. And that's a big movement, I think, in the contemporary life sciences, from sequencing genomes and analyzing biomolecules and their structure and their interactions towards a more synthetic, literally a synthetic approach, synthetic biology, such as, for example, building a synthetic cell, bringing all these experiences and all these insights together again, the negation of the negation, as Hegel would phrase it, which is, of course, something positive, something whole again. But is it the real thing? This synthetic cell, is it really a convincing model of the living organism, or have we lost something on the way? That's a very important question, of course. But I like to ask these questions also on the basis of what is happening in real scientific projects. And that's well, just one example of how I try to combine Hegelian logic in this example with what is happening in live scientific projects. And so for me, dialectics is a research program. It's a method resulting in a system, an encyclopedia, but that's always work in progress. It's always a process. It's never finished. For me, dialectics is never finished. Is it possible to be a Hegelian today? A very famous question. Many people have asked that question, and my answer is very affirmative. Yes, we should be Hegelians today. We should try to be Hegelians. For example, what is an experiment? Isn't that a dialectical syllogism from an initial position via exposure, contradiction, negation, refutation to a more developed, more validated, more comprehensive insight? Isn't that basically what an experiment in life sciences research is? What Hegel tries to explain is that not only nature and natural processes are inherently dialectical, but also the way we work in science. Science itself is a dialectical process, and that's why philosophy is interesting, because we can make this implicit dialectics of science more visible. I also think for example, another interesting example from Hegel is, of course, master and the servant. I think this is about the relationship between philosophy and science, where initially the philosopher is the contemplating master, the scientist is doing the hard work, but eventually there is a reversal in the relationship, and all of a sudden these scientists become increasingly powerful, and then the master, so to speak, has to try to come to terms with this new power situation, this reversed power relationship. What I also like to do very much as well, traveling together with scientists, is to say, wait a minute, we are walking in an interesting direction, but in order to do that, every now and then you have to take a step backwards. The famous Heideggerian Schritt zurück, back to the primal scene. Where did it start? Where did, for example, contemporary life sciences, where did it start? What was the first moment where the basic desire of the contemporary life sciences became very visible. And for me, and a very important moment is, for example, Faust by Goethe, this famous laboratory scene about creating life in a laboratory. For me, that's a very anticipatory moment, because Goethe already understood, and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley also understood that the basic desire of science is creating life in the laboratory. And that's what we are about to do, as it seems to be the case, at least. If you look at synthetic biology, although, of course, you can ask a question whether these fake cells are really convincing models of real life. But if you look back to this famous laboratory scene in Faust, it's very anticipatory. What Wagner, Faust's pupil, is doing in the laboratory, mixing together things to create new life, something which is very vulnerable. But then a moment of dual use, Mr. Mephistopheles comes in, he steals this little creature and wants to use it for his own purposes. The whole, let's say, script of the life sciences, I would say, is already in there. Or to take another example, well, we talked about Corona before this meeting. Maxim Gorky wrote a fascinating play about cholera, but actually, if you read this play, he already anticipated many of the dynamics which nowadays in the era of Corona is still valid. So that's how we, as a philosopher, can help, let's say, can foster critical reflection about science by, for example, using other sources of knowledge, going back to primal moments, using novels, drama, etc. Of course, the big challenges, as Habermas already explained, that, well, given the fact that science is becoming technoscience, is becoming increasingly technological, this means that the role of human beings, including the role of individual scientists, is marginalized. Science is becoming a practice where big machines, computers, CERN, well, whatever you can think of, is playing an important role. And it's not only marginalizing, let's say, the traditional laboratory skills of researchers, but it's also marginalizing reflection. So we have to make an effort to reintroduce critical reflection into science as a practice. This reflection, what is also interesting, I think, is that this reflection is no longer the work of single authors in their study. It's not this one genius, whether it's Hegel or someone else, who tries to come to terms with what is happening in the world. It should be a distributed effort. We should, as networks of authors, we should try to come to terms with what is happening in the world of today. I also liked, so oblique perspective, step backwards, paying attention to language. That's very important. In my book, I also try to zoom into some case studies, basically to show that continental philosophy can do case studies as well. That's not the privilege of bioethics or something like that. It's interesting for continental philosophy to address case studies as well. One of the case studies, for example, which I discussed, was about the malaria mosquito. Well, first of all, because it demonstrates what I would like to refer to as the negativity of science. Why are scientists interested in malaria mosquitoes, basically in something else, the pathogen hiding inside the gut of this mosquito, to destroy it, to eliminate it, the negativity of science, to knock out this pathogen, so to speak. But what is interesting from a continental philosophy is, well, many things, many aspects, but already, first of all, the name of this organism. If you dive into malaria as a case study, the first thing which strikes me as a philosopher, a continental philosopher, is the name. The malaria mosquito, Anopheles, which literally means useless. It's the alpha privative of Heidegger, the A, it's useless, it's worthless, and at the same time, well, thousands of researchers are spending decades of their life studying this worthless, this useless organism. That's already, for me, a very fascinating tension, so to speak. So start with the language, start with the name of the organism if you dive into a case study. And of course, it's a negative adventure. You try to eliminate the threat, so to speak. And at the same time, it's a negation of the negation because you try to foster immunity. So, well, again, a dialectical process. I won't go into too much details, but I see this dialectical syllogism everywhere. Of course, or another case study which I did in my book is, well, a very simple one at first glance, at least. The test tube, which is a very quasi-self-evident thing, which you can still find in all laboratories, all life sciences laboratories, at least across the world. It's a kind of artificial void, an object without properties. But at the same time, it exemplifies the will to control, because this apparently vulnerable thing allows us to control objects. It's the will to control. It seems very vulnerable, but it's actually a tool of control, a tool of power. It's an object without characteristics, so to speak. It's emptiness. It's a clearing, if you like, waiting for something, a molecule, something new, a novelty, something whose logical status seems yet uncertain. And it's very interesting, I think, for continental philosophers to think about what is a test tube. I won't go into too much details today, but I think that, well, continental philosophy has something to say about the dialectics of the test tube, because you start with living nature, you use the test tube to analyze it, to take it apart, to zoom in on very specific things, and then in the end to recombine these things and create something new. The whole dialectical scheme is there. Let me see how I'm doing in time. I think I'll skip a few slides because I'm too fascinated to hear the other discussions. So, well, for me, I see these dialectical syllogisms everywhere, also in nature, also in living nature, also in the history of the life sciences and contemporary research practices. Think about, for example, genomics. Starting point is, well, life is a genome, basically. Life is a code, a program. And initially that seems to be the case. And this program is challenged, exposed to a negative environment, not very friendly usually, but especially this challenging environment allows in the end this organism to develop. And also our thinking about this organism is dialectical. We start with the concept that everything is DNA. So once we genome a sequence, we think we know and understand the organism. But then, of course, at the same time, we have the very important experience that once you have sequenced the genome, that knowledge is very limited. And in the end, you understand that what you need to know is also the environment, also nurture, and life is an interaction between nature and nurture, between genome and environment. And that's the third moment of the dialectical process. So you start with initial position, then this initial position is challenged, it's negated. No, it's not about genomes, it's about the environment, or the other way around. And then in the end, you see both as moments of a more comprehensive view. So that's what I try to explain in my book. I skip a few slides because I also wanted to share a few slides, or spend a few slides on this thinker who I think has been not sufficiently acknowledged as an important dialectical thinker, Friedrich Engels, who wrote a number of, I would say, unfinished manuscripts and publications about, let's say, a materialist dialectical approach to knowledge. I spent a special chapter, so to speak, of my book on his work. And one of the interesting things is that he, at a certain point, he decided, also in discussion with Marx, he decided that he would focus on science, whereas Marx would focus on political economy and economics. He would focus on science. He was never able to finish this project, but he decided that in order to understand contemporary science in the late 19th century, he had to reread old Hegel. So his project consists of two dimensions: rereading Hegel, the hero of his youth, and diving into the discourse and the practices of 19th century science. And basically, he argued that, well, 19th century science is about three decisive developments. Well, it takes dialectics to understand what is happening in the 19th century. Physiology of the cell is very important, but you should combine this with the laws of thermodynamics. And the first law is, of course, about conservation. The second law is about entropy. And the third moment, dialectically speaking, is life, which is a negation of the negation, so to speak. Negative entropy, which is something positive. Because Engels was extremely fascinated, like Hegel himself, by life. How can life exist? In a world of entropy, there are these very complex cells and organisms who maintain complexity at a very highly advanced level. How is that possible in a world under the sway of negativity, under the sway of entropy? How is negative entropy equals life? How is that possible? And that was Engels' big question. And what he also predicted was that at a certain point, scientists would not only try to analyze life by taking cells together, by taking cells apart, so to speak, destroying life, the negativity of science, try to understand life by destroying life, but also to put it together again, to recreate, for example, proteins in the laboratory. That would be an inevitable dialectical development, according to Engels. Sooner or later, scientists will try to do that. They will try to create artificial life or artificial proteins, at least, in their laboratories. And then that project will exemplify that contemporary science is no longer about life as a phenomenon. It's about trying to come to terms with the noumenal essence of life, the noumenal building blocks of life. That's what contemporary science tries to understand. Open up the noumenal dimension. Kant claimed that would be impossible for human beings. According to Engels, that's precisely what contemporary technoscience is doing, opening up, revealing, disclosing the noumenal dimension of life, nature, matter, etc. And well, look here, Bachelard, from working from a completely different perspective, as a phenomenologist and as a psychoanalyst of science, he came to the same conclusion. Science, technoscience, after 1900 especially, is about opening up the noumenal dimension of nature, the elemental particles, the surreal non-entities of life, matter, energy, etc., via high-tech equipment and high-tech experiments on the one hand, via advanced mathematics on the other hand. Contemporary science tried to understand the noumenal structure of life and open it up for manipulation. That's basically what the technicity of science is trying to achieve. With our natural organs, we see life, nature in a phenomenological way, but with our high-tech equipment, our high-tech contrivances, we try to open up the noumenal dimension of life and nature, and that is precisely what contemporary science is doing. Sequencing genes, but also studying subatomic particles, etc. And well, as a very final comment from my side, and I think that in that case I stayed within my 45 minutes, although I hope you are still with me because I can't see any faces, but that's no problem. Just as a final case study, I am very fascinated by also by elementary particle physics, of course. And this, I think, is a very fascinating example. The famous Majorana particle, which was predicted by an Italian physicist in 1937, who, after his big prediction, disappeared. Some said he committed suicide because his project was finished. Others said he went into a convent. He became a monk. Well, leaving that biographical mystery aside, his work was, let's say, rediscovered by especially a group in Delft who claimed that they actually observed Majorana particles, very mysterious particles. We don't know yet whether they really exist. We don't know what existence means when you talk about these kinds of particles. But they are becoming very important because they could be the building blocks for quantum computing. So high-tech, cutting-edge developments. And they were very triumphant. We have discovered Majorana particles. Yes, they exist. But before long, there are many questions and concerns. And now integrity committees are put to work whether this wasn't the case of fraud, actually. So the Majorana particle, to use a Lacanian concept, as an object A, a mysterious object, or rather actant, something which draws the energy, attention of research groups. They are fascinated by it. Everything they have, all their money, all their funding, all their tools, all their energy, all their time is spent on trying to catch it, trying to come to terms with it. But in the end, well, it ends with despair and fraud. And that's, well, something which Lacan would have predicted. Okay, that's my final case study. And I think that's also my final class slide. So well, thank you very much for paying attention, and very much look forward to the discussion. And I hope my summary was a bit clear and made sense to you.
Thanks a lot, Huub. Yeah, it was very clear, and there was already a discussion going on in the chat box. So there are already some questions. So but we will have to wait for that, because we have to give the floor now to Natalia Juchniewicz, who has worked the whole weekend on a paper, and she will read it, right? You don't have a PowerPoint presentation.
No, I'm gonna read this. Well, I hope in an engaging enough way, not to make everyone bored with my speech, because I have to say that I've decided to focus especially on the structure of this book, and I would say the general project which is assumed and was developed by Zwart in this book, because I really think this is very interesting, and moreover, I have to say that today my speech corresponds very well with the introduction of Zwart, because he mentioned or focused mainly on the empirical examples where we can see how this method works, whereas I would like rather to emphasize the philosophical significance of this project.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So in his book, Continental Philosophy of Technoscience, Professor Zwart undertakes a crucial problem for contemporary philosophy of technology and technoscience, the problem of status of philosophical thinking in the context of present technoscientific developments. Zwart states that through the theories of so-called continental philosophers, it is possible to build a new or maybe refreshed perspective on technoscientific changes. His main postulate in the book is to look at the continental theories as offering as a methodological philosophical research. How could continental theories help us to understand our present technoscientific conditions? How can we use the continental approach to the current field of philosophical and generally technoscientific research? These questions form the main aim of this book, and in my opinion, the problems which they highlight are of the utmost importance. After the empirical turn in the philosophy of technology, continental philosophy became a reservoir of sometimes useful, but more often odd concepts and theories which might assist in building the argumentation in research, but are not treated as giving us a general perspective which might be accepted. What could Hegel, 19th century thinker, know about modern technologies? What could Marx know about the 21st century capitalism? Isn't Heideggerian theory of technology too naive? Usually, we compare different thinkers to see the differences and similarities among them, to emphasize who was closer to the right interpretation of reality, being, moreover, in accordance with our own perspective. Zwart, first of all, does not choose this easy path of looking for philosophical alliances, and secondly, states the problem in a more complicated but also interesting way. He looks for a research program, an evolving research program, which according to him might be extracted on a meta level of analysis from the continental theory of technology. This is, on the one hand, an approach where different thinkers are not treated as opposing to each other, but as developing a common perspective on technoscience. On the other hand, it demands a very specific method of analysis. That what is being analyzed are not the details of different, often well-known theories, but the way of thinking about the role of philosophy in analyzing technoscientific changes which these theories offer. That is why Zwart chooses to focus on dialectics, psychoanalysis, and phenomenology as three main continental approaches. All of these approaches, having their own uniqueness, try to motivate us to look at the technoscientific changes from a wider perspective, looking not only at very detailed examples, but also at more general tendencies, biases, or forms of thinking which we collectively build. So the ambition of Zwart, however, is not only to offer us another interpretation of the role of philosophical thinking today. He wants to teach us how to practice philosophy of technoscience today. From the very beginning, the inner dialectical relation between theory and praxis, thinking and doing, is highlighted in the presuppositions of Zwart, and he forces us to rethink what this relation means for us today. Dialectics is the most important concept and a method of thinking reintroduced to philosophy of technology by Zwart in his book. He starts with the Hegelian dialectics and ends with the phenomenology of Teilhard, rooted in a dialectical way of thinking. Dialectics is a fundamental concept of the analyzed theories, but also a more general method of Zwart's analysis. He is a dialectical thinker. Well, I hope he will confirm that he is a dialectical thinker. And in his project, he proves how dialectics might be applied to philosophical analysis. And I am truly impressed by the idea to reinstate the dialectics to our philosophical thinking, and moreover, by the way how Zwart did it. I have to admit that Zwart avoided the common and constantly repeated mistake of thinking about the dialectics as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which is a horror for Hegelians. And he truly explained the meaning of dialectical thinking, highlighting especially how important the concept of syllogism is for the way people think, and the fact that dialectics is a processual, spiraling form of development. Dialectics, according to Zwart, is not a label which might be stuck to the 19th century thinkers and simply forgotten, but is a way how we think of science and technology, and even more importantly, how we do them. Dialectics is the most general pattern assumes three moments of the development of knowledge. First, unquestioned concepts and assumptions. Second, negativity about the validity of the concept. Third, the negation of the negation, the higher level of understanding, sublation, Aufhebung, where phenomena may confirm our predictions. Zwart uses this pattern to a plethora of examples, from purely theoretical ones to empirical cases, showing that on a general level, the whole development of technoscience is dialectical. This is actually the way how we test our hypotheses, conduct experiments, and treat different scientific discoveries. Without dialectics, our knowledge would be static, there would be no progress. What I really like in this book is the fact that, that it elaborates the well-known philosophical approaches whilst giving them significance for our current research. Zwart does not fear to combine Hegelian concept with DNA or Marxian analysis of human nature exchange with astronomy. For example, Anton Pannekoek theory. The reader knows that the next page of this book might offer a new and inspiring example, unique association, or simply an interesting combination of theory and practice. Each chapter is built dialectically, in my opinion. Zwart starts from the very general assumptions about the analyzed theory, then shows different particular applications of the theory to practice, revealing its inner problems and contradictions to finally transcend them in the final subchapters, offering a concrete role of the theory for technoscience research. This makes Zwart's project philosophically incredibly complex, but also extremely engaging from a perspective of a reader. That is why dialectics is so important for Zwart's project. It delivers both the theory and practice, since it is based on the assumption that being means being at work, a process of self-realization, on the way to stability and fulfillment, and perceives the development as self-realization of a concept. However, with the concept of dialectics, some doubts might arise about this project. Dialectics assumes the development of a concept and a moment of its fulfillment. So do we have any limits in technoscience? Will there be a moment when progress will not be possible? Moreover, who is responsible for the telos, the aim of this development? From dialectical point of view, it might be said that a concept reveals itself. In Hegelian vocabulary, the spirit achieves a moment of self-understanding and fulfillment. So the human activities are rather perceived as the expression of the cunning of reason. We are only tools for the development of the spirit. So how it is possible? Is it possible at all to control the conditions of our own progress? Do we still need to progress, knowing that this concept affects a very instrumental treatment of nature and human environment? Isn't dialectics too abstract or too metaphysical, especially after the years of emphasizing the role of relevant social groups in SCOT, grassroots knowledge in STS, and delegations of human activities to the objects in post-phenomenology of technology? But unfortunately for this critique, Zwart has predicted the above-mentioned accusations, and in his approach, he follows Slavoj Žižek, who claims that in the dialectical process, there is no normal progress. Dialectics is not a mechanical procedure. It has its own moments of doubts, and nothing comes from the sky as a simple solution. In this sense, I believe that Zwart tries to introduce to his concept of dialectics the philosophical empirical approach, but treats it as a moment in the development, not as the final method of philosophical investigation. In my opinion, Zwart discloses his convictions about philosophy, especially when he analyzes the theory of Althusser. He didn't mention that in the introduction, but I believe that the chapter about Althusser is crucial. Even if Althusser is not a thinker who easily suits this project, Zwart clearly highlights the arguments taken from the theory of the French philosopher, which have to be implemented to our way of thinking about the relation of philosophy and technoscience. Zwart sums up the project of Althusser in 6 points. Philosophy is a practice. Philosophy is first and foremost a reading practice. Every science has a logic of its own, and philosophy has to bring this logic to the surface. Key dialectical concepts must be continuously validated and redefined. Understanding of science and as an experimental practice where facts are treated not as a starting point, but as the outcome of a dialectical process. And the last, continuous interaction between the spontaneous dialectic of technoscience and dialectics as a practice of transformative assessment and intervention. Following this dialectical way of thinking, Zwart analyzes continental philosophy, starting with the Hegelian theory, then presenting materialistic, psychoanalytic and phenomenological perspective, ending with the theory which in some sense transcends them all, introducing the concept of noosphere and hyperintelligence. Considering the fact that this project is based on the concept of dialectics, I would like to ask why the Hegelian concept of teleology was not introduced to the analysis, and why the negative dialectics of Adorno was not mentioned in this project. The lack of Adorno's theory is especially striking because on a meta level of analysis of this project, so I'm sorry, but I'm trying to build a meta level of a meta level, but on a meta level of analysis of this project, where dialectics is a method of thinking which might be perceived as a positive, the general approach, the initial point of view, and the negative dialectics of Adorno might be understood as a moment of negation, moment of particularity, a moment when our belief in the philosophical concepts is being undermined. And then the question about our current position, the need to look for the negation of the negation, would be even more clearly justified. Zwart, as I said, starts with Hegel, but also with the Aristotelian root of Hegelian project oriented around the concept of energeia, actuality, to explain what dialectics is and how it might be applied to the analysis of nature. That is why he's mainly focused on Hegelian logic and an encyclopedia of sciences. This gives an impression as if in the Hegelian theory, the research of nature was the most important, which is obviously not true. Zwart, however, focuses on the dialectics of nature, not because it is, according to him, the only sphere where dialectics might be seen, but because it gives him a possibility to connect this project with the next one, dialectical materialism. Analyzing the theory of Marx and especially of Engels, Zwart emphasizes the fact that scientific convictions and ideas are shaped in the interaction with nature under specific socio-economic conditions in the context of actual research practices in laboratories and industries. It was a quotation, of course. What is a good basis for the introduction of theories, especially of Bachelard and Lacan? They focus on the man-made forms of knowledge based on language and symbolization, which reveals the fact that our way of thinking is also interwoven with the dialectics of discourse and meaning. It gives place for Althusser and his analysis of philosophy as intervention and transformation conducted in the reading practice. Through dialectical methods, it is possible to reveal the ideological level of concepts and to justify the need of intervention understood as the transcendency of ideology. This level of analysis delivers the chance to look at thinking not as an individual undertaking, but as a collective one. In the theory of Althusser, Zwart finds thinking as a function of a particular system, an apparatus of thinking, a particular mode of knowledge production emerging in a particular historical context, which results in the conclusion that thinking is a part of system. This, however, raises a question about the status of our thinking and being, the meaning of our life in the imposed technoscientific system in which we were born. That is why Zwart turns to Heidegger and his analysis of the condition of being, human existence in the environment, which is technologically defined. Finally, he focuses on the problems raised by Heidegger, analyzing the concept of noosphere by Taylor de Chardin, which is also a theoretical closure of his own project. So in my meta-analysis, of course, and I hope that this is right. Through the concept of hyper-consciousness, Zwart emphasizes the need to learn and think collectively to build a holistic approach to the concept of technoscience. It is also an interesting moment of Hegelian coming back of the spirit to itself, since the theory of Taylor introduces the concept of spirit as built on moving forward within us via culture and technology as augmented forms of consciousness and transmittable reflection. In my opinion, this is already clear in the Hegelian project of the objective spirit, but the fact that Zwart undertakes this problem of collective intelligence as a result of his own dialectical analysis is not accidental. If we want to treat dialectics not only as a method of analysis of the past, but also as a method which might give us a chance to think responsibly about the future, the conclusion that the spirit is inside of our technoscientific practice and develops through human activities makes philosophical reflection on it even more important. The fact is that if we want to treat science and technology as giving us an access to the truth, we have to pose the question about the status of current philosophical investigations. We have to understand the dialectics of our own thinking practice. At the beginning of his book, Zwart asks how these continental perspectives enable us to face emerging global challenges in an era of ecological disruption and technification of nature. And I would say that luckily for us, he gives us philosophical tools to undertake this project, to think about our current situation and the nearest future, to think and do science, not only to interpret its results. So this is my response to the introduction of Zwart, and I hope it wasn't too theoretical, but I really wanted to emphasize, well, in my opinion, the general idea for this project. And I hope that Huub will agree with me that my interpretation was at least close to his own intentions. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Natalia, for this indeed very thorough reading of Huub's book and Huub's dialectical method, insofar as it differs from Hegel's and Engels and Marx's. Thanks a lot. Yeah, Huub, you have to wait with a response because we first have another speaker, our dear friend Vincent Blok. Do you have a written text, Vincent, or a PowerPoint?
I don't have a PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, also written text. Please, we're looking forward to it. The floor is yours, Vincent.
Thank you, Pieter. Also, thank you for the kind introduction. Yeah, Huub, you can imagine that I was honored to be asked to respond to your book. And you can feel safe. I will not be critical about your book today. And that is not only because I want to be a nice guy today, but it's also content-wise. I feel that I feel that we are in a way philosophical soulmates, because we both stress the importance of philosophical method. That is, the question how philosophy can have access to the subject matter of philosophy. And in my own work, I have shown that the crisis of contemporary philosophy consists in the indifference towards philosophical methods. And I have illustrated this with a critical reflection on philosophers like Meillassoux, Harman, and Timothy Morton, for instance. In my view, Huub's book is primarily about philosophical methods, and it was, luckily enough, also by the previous speaker acknowledged. Maybe not so much indicating the problem of this indifference, but more a progressive next step how philosophers could do methodological reflection. And therefore, the book is a must-read for everyone in this room, I would say. But also to make a little bit of a case why people should read the book, I will not respond to particular issues and questions in the book. We can do that later, Huub. But I would like to illustrate this methodological indifference of philosophy with the example of intercultural philosophies of technology and its attention for indigenous local ontologies in times of global warming. And with this example, I will try to convince the audience that methodological reflection is urgently needed and that you should all read this book. So that is the objective that I have. So let me first tell you a little bit about global warming. As the experience of global warming does not primarily consist in the experience of new physical objects like raindrops, storms, and tsunamis. What is at stake is a shift in the meaning of raindrops and storms as indicators of a global phenomenon, global warming. This already becomes clear in our daily conversations about the weather, that's something we like to do in the Netherlands. If we say, for instance, that it's relatively warm for the time of the year, this conversation is already determined by the global phenomenon of global warming. In times of global warming, we experience a global phenomenon we were not aware of in previous times when we only experienced objects, the climate in which we self-evidently live and on which our human existence depends. This climate concerns the whole of being in the sense that in times of global warming, there is no position possible outside of it. And whereas in earlier ages, it was possible to externalize waste to the environment, we nowadays realize that every externalization is in the end internalized in the Earth system and impacts Earth life support systems. And this is a great experience, I can tell you. As this experience of a global phenomenon means that we have a metaphysical experience of the world in times of global warming. Why do I refer to metaphysics? I just use a definition of metaphysics that you can find in Was ist Metaphysik from Heidegger, in which he argues metaphysical experience concerns the whole of being, and in such a way that the one who understands this whole is included in this whole. And this is interesting to consider because metaphysical experiences of a world beyond the material objects was rejected by flat ontologists like Latour, while the experience of global warming rehabilitates this metaphysical experience of the whole of being, that is, the world in which the one who experiences this whole is included as well. This world is also called, also associated with the Anthropocene. And with the notion of Anthropocene, we do not want to introduce a historical fact, for instance, the geological era that started with the Trinity test in 1945, but we want to indicate an ontological phenomenon. Climate change disrupts the way of appearance of the world as a whole and the way humans respond to this world. It disrupts the world as a relatively stable background for our being in the world, and a new unstable world emerges as background for our being in the world. And contrary to the Holocene, local categories like urban versus rural, nature versus culture, north versus south, and west versus east eroded and emerge now as a global interior milieu in which nature and human existence become completely intertwined. This is what Nietzsche already foresaw in terms of the naturalization of man and the humanization of nature, and what Ernst Jünger and Martin Heidegger later experienced in terms of the total mobilization and framing, and today turns out to threaten the survival of humans on planet Earth. One could ask now, if global warming in the Anthropocene concerns the whole of being, which is determined by total mobilization of the categories in the Anthropocene, to what extent is there still room for local categories? For instance, non-Western cosmologies, Ubuntu, or traditional Chinese philosophies? I would say, if we take the experience of global warming in the Anthropocene serious, that means that this climate concerns the whole of being and that there is no position possible outside of it, and everything is internalized in the Earth system, then every local category is already absorbed in this global phenomenon. This is also not a problem. Intercultural philosophies of technology introduce local categories to achieve the unification between the cosmic order and the moral order, or to overcome the discontinuities between nature and culture. But we don't need such local categories, as the total mobilization of all categories in the Anthropocene already achieved that for us. In other words, in the Anthropocene, local categories are not only erased, but also not needed anymore, as this unification and overcoming of discontinuity is already achieved. Now, you might disagree with me because you have some deeper feelings about nature or human flourishing. And I have to admit that I have the same type of intuitions. That is not the problem. But instead of an a priori acceptance of local categories, we should at least address two problems. First of all, the acceptance of local categories implies already the rejection of the globality of global warming in the Anthropocene, in which the survival of human existence on Earth is threatened. Either there is the totality of the Gestell or enframing in the Anthropocene, but then there are no local categories left, or there are still local categories, but then there is no totality of the Gestell. You cannot have both, I would say. Second, and more important for the discussion of Huub Zwart's book today, the reintroduction of local categories in the globality of enframing in the Anthropocene requires the methodological question how we can have access to our subject matter, in this case, local categories, and how we can discuss them with others. The problem is that access to local categories and the difference between philosophies is presupposed, while one could wonder whether it is legitimized to assume such differences if at least the language that determines these different philosophies is the same. If we care for language, as Huub convincingly shows in his book, it turns out that both intercultural philosophies of technology and technology as enframing involves the same unification and the same overcoming of discontinuities. There's also insufficient reflection in intercultural philosophies of technology on the methodological question how we can discuss this locality of these categories in a proper way. Access to local categories is presupposed and communicated via their translation into English, communications via homogeneous scientific articles and books about the inspiration of Ubuntu, DAO, etc., in which their locality and difference is already lifted by the globality of the English translation. This translation is in a unified global language already implies that the locality of local categories is eradicated. Also here, I would argue that I can recommend a reading of Huub's book, especially the chapter on phenomenology can be helpful in this regard. I don't want to be cynical about non-Western traditions of philosophy, as I do see the advantage of indigenous epistemologies. For instance, at Wageningen University, my colleague David Ludwig is doing great work in applied ethics of technology, for instance, in Africa. But should we not assume a fundamental asymmetry between philosophies of technology if we want to take non-Western traditions really serious? And shouldn't we then not outline a philosophy of technology that interrupts the tendency towards unification in both enframing and in current intercultural philosophies of technology? These are questions that are urgent in times of global warming, I would say, and especially if we remember that some authors even call for a totalitarian approach, inspired by Stalin even, a totalitarian approach of the climate crisis. It calls for an explicit reflection on philosophical method if we want to take the plurality of categories serious. And although I think that dialectics of technoscience will not be of help, as it in the end also focuses on unification and the overcoming of difference, I think that philosophers of technology should read the new book by Zwart to address these type of questions. I congratulate you again with this great achievement, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Vincent, for this very different reading, a very different focus of the book. I suppose that your response was also a little bit directed to Juchniewicz. Thank you, Huub. Do you want to respond to both speakers very briefly before we start with the Q&A?
Yes, if I may. I mean,
yeah.
Try to keep it short because, well, both comments were extremely interesting and helpful and challenging and to dive into. But let me briefly summarize some small comments, merely to indicate how much I appreciate these reviews, if I may call them like that. Well, let's start with Natalia's review. Well, three things. At a certain point, the famous question was raised, well, Hegel, what did Hegel know early 19th century about the world we live in today, especially in terms of science? Well, besides the fact that early 19th century science was extremely decisive and important, and a very decisive moment in science, think about chemistry, for example. It's well, basically it's about the dialectical logic, which I try to reintroduce or re-acknowledge. And indeed, in archaea, being at work, everything is at work, everything is a process, everything is in archaea, the Aristotelian concept. Well, that's for me indeed, and it's good of you to point it out, a very important key concept of dialectics. The world is at work, so to speak. Will there be, well, that's not a mechanical way of thinking. For me, dialectics is about despair, about doubt, about painful experience of refutation and negation. And it's never a given where it will end, and the process will always start again. Yes, there is this drive towards integration, towards the whole, but as Lacan once said, there is always a hole in the whole, and there is always a gap. There is always well, a new negation looming up. So yes, there is this desire for a telos, something we want to achieve together, but at the same time, well, new frustrations will inevitably emerge. And that's the basic experience of the dialectical endeavor. Yes, it's a very good question. What happened to Adorno? Why isn't he given a separate chapter in the book? Actually, yeah, I was challenged to think about Althusser. You refer to him quite a lot because he's an anti-Hegelian dialectical thinker, and so I tried my best to at least address that work. But yeah, maybe I should have also devoted a chapter to Adorno. But then, well, the risk is, of course, that once again you dive into author studies. What's the relationship between Hegel and Schelling, and between Adorno and Habermas, and before you know it, you're no longer talking about technoscience. So yes, it's Adorno is a very important thinker, and especially the critical theory tradition. But yeah, I didn't want to lose track of my basic ambition, this mutual confrontation between continental philosophy and technoscience, although more chapters, if it would have been an encyclopedia of continental philosophy, more chapters should have been written, of course. But thanks again for your rich comment. You addressed many other issues as well. In terms of Vincent's review, yes, I share the experience that we should move beyond indifference towards methodology, to develop a validated methodology is extremely important. And it's also very important to acknowledge that many of these continental thinkers were actually system or process thinkers. Hegel challenged us already to think of planet Earth as one system. I found it very interesting to discover that Heidegger, in his youth, in World War I actually, had worked on a weather station, and maybe that helped him to acknowledge that rather than looking at barometers, you should look at, well, the whole, to understand in what kind of condition we are moving. He was
also a coward, eh?
Yeah, power, yeah, absolutely.
No, I meant the coward.
Oh yeah. No, he wasn't.
He was afraid for his academic career, so that was one of the reasons that he wanted.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no, I quite agree with that. And yes, Hegel also thought about crisis, of course, but that was largely about a political crisis. He wasn't yet a thinker of the Anthropocene, of course. Marx talked about the metabolism between nature and society. So there is also this systemic dimension in his work. But of course, the Anthropocene is a completely new challenge, which forces us to see us as part of the system, as part of the crisis. And at the same time, I would say, still, we have a special position even within the Anthropocene, in the sense that we know what we are doing, we know the impact of what we are doing, we can even measure that, so to speak, and that triggers or should trigger our responsibility, although very often we actually fail to respond to this appeal to our responsibility. But well, those are some of the things which came to my mind. I completely acknowledge that I didn't do justice to the richness of both reviews, but and I'll also need some time to digest. But I think, well, I really appreciate both comments, because for me they were very helpful. Yes, indigenous thinking will help us to supersede the object-subject divide, but at the same time, yeah, we have to redefine our special position as well, self-conscious, self-critical, dialectical subjects in this contemporary condition of the Anthropocene. So that would be some short comments to what I heard, but of course much more could be said. But I'm also very eager to respond to some of the comments in the chat. For example, this comment about the clearing. I would like to comment on that as well. But I give the floor back to the chair.
Yeah, of course, we will have time for that. Maybe if you want to briefly respond to this response, Natalia or Vincent, then you can do that now. If not, let's go to the chat. Indeed, in the
Very
chat.
quickly,
Sure, yeah.
I just want to say that my initial questions about the role of Hegel was not a critical question, actually. I really agree with your project, and I have to say that for me it was a very surprising and sometimes even a bit, I had a bit strange feelings when I was reading this book, because well, we share so many similar ways of thinking. For example, the focus on a concept of a syllogism, or generally assuming that dialectics is not only a method but also a part, of course, of that how we can analyze different changes in the existence of things. So, well, I just want to say that I really like this project, and it really reminded me about so many interesting minor thinkers who are not generally we do not focus on them so often, that I really want to say that I appreciate this book also for all of those minor heroes who build the whole structure. So just that's it. So thank you.
Your companion dialectic. Oh, sorry, Vincent.
Yeah, maybe also briefly comment. Thank you. So there is, more from a systematic perspective, there is a risk of claiming a sort of epistemic superiority because we are conscious of the Anthropocene. We have a particular responsibility. That is also a position that you can find in Clive Hamilton, for instance, that we have the responsibility to create the world. While at the same time, I would say that your book also can be read, or I have read it, as a sort of criticism of a subject-object distinction, while there is a huge risk to rehabilitate, in your framing, an epistemic superiority of a subject. While, and then I end, Pieter, so forgive me, but you can also have an alternative approach. If you look at Heidegger and Heidegger's methodology, method of philosophy, according to Heidegger, the only way we can have access to the whole of being is via a fundamental mood. So the Langeweile or Angst, these are the fundamental moods. And that is not an access of the whole of being via the subject, but that is the whole point of the notion of Befindlichkeit in Sein und Zeit, for instance. So what we should do if we talk about responsibility in the Anthropocene, I think, is to ask for the fundamental mood or attunement that is at stake in the particular context of the Anthropocene. And if we want to reintroduce or rehabilitate locality, then I don't think you can ever have access to local categories without a methodological move like fundamental moods. And then this could be then also a method that moves beyond epistemological superiority, and then hopefully we find an answer to the question. But it's just a consideration of your last remark. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vincent. Yeah, we have one question from Stefan van Gele in the chat. Unfortunately, Stefan has left the building, or left the room, so to speak, but maybe you want to respond. You talked about the test tube being a kind of clearing.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting question. It was a bit of a provocative remark from my side, of course, to use that term. But at the same time, I used it consciously, and not only because a test tube is indeed this artificial void, which makes something possible, which clears away everything else, but also because this test tube is a kind of symptomatic exemplification of, let's say, laboratory as such, or technoscience as such. It's this desire to make a clear, void, empty environment without any intrusions from nature, something completely in control. And this is, let's say, what is opened up by technoscience. It's a space, and also a mood, perhaps, and then, well, fill in a very filtered way, in a very controlled way, allow very small samples of reality, of nature, to enter into that space. So you could call that a clearing. At the same time, it's of course a threat to how nature is and presents itself to us in its own dynamics. And well, that's why we need a philosophical clearing to understand and to expose this, well, let's say, hidden dialectic of technoscientific endeavor, and to make it explicit what this is doing, both also in terms of negativity, literally, in terms of well, the damage that is being done to nature on the basis of this power structure, so to speak. But well, much more can be said about it. But I just wanted to mention that I appreciated this question very much, and it's yeah, it's of course a very important topic.
Yeah, I was wondering myself, just a brief question. You also discussed the coronavirus or the COVID disease a little bit. Could you also say that the virus in a way acts as a kind of alethetic entity in a way, which makes the whole Vincent talks about it, to a kind of big outside laboratory, you know, significantly affecting the clearing in a more Heideggerian sense?
Yeah, you could say that, well, from the perspective of technoscience, all the world is becoming a laboratory. So laboratories used to be these, well, artificial voids, this clean spaces, sorry. But, well, laboratories have disseminated, so to speak, they have spread. There is also an epidemic of laboratories, so to speak. Everything is a laboratory now. We are all research subjects, whether we know it or not. We're all producers of data. And so technoscience has transformed the world into one big global laboratory. And well, of course, there are other ways of experiencing the world. There are other moods possible I think, I hope, but this is a very strong dynamic. This is a metaphysical impetus in technoscience to transform the whole world into one big laboratory where we need technoscience to address challenges such as COVID.
Yeah. But the fact is, of course, that we have a big issue with controlling it at the moment.
Yes, and yeah, if you talk about, let's say, societal discontent in COVID, well, read Gorky, because he explains. He perfectly explains all the discussions about COVID, etc. He uses cholera, completely different disease, but the dynamics of suspicion and discontent it's very similar to what is happening today. So yeah, great author.
Yeah, thank you. I will definitely take a look at that. We have 3 questions in the Q&A window, and I'm not sure if Joel is still present, but I hope so. This was I shall read it. You talk about Engels, Friedrich Engels, is indeed a fascinating figure. Well, I agree. It's interesting that you mentioned thermodynamics. The idea that life is negentropic is rather a persistent misconception that has persisted precisely from Engels, Bergson, etc. There is also like writing on entropy in Engels, and a rather large prejudice toward the first law. For example, he tries to refute the heat death of the universe in the dialectics of nature. Are you still present, Joel, or? Yes.
Okay.
Can you come online, or is that possible technically? Or is this enough for you to respond, Huub? Wait a minute.
Yeah, I can
Hello?
try to respond, but
Hi, Joel, are you okay?
Yes. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Technically very good, Pieter. Yeah, I suppose you kind of read it out, but it was interesting that you dialectically read Engels and the movement between the first law through to a kind of negentropic approach by Engels. I'm just sort of questioning that reading, really, just because Engels for me seems to be quite a kind of a resentful thinker towards entropy. And the writings that he does do on thermodynamics are precisely there in order to, the use of the first law is something that is used to kind of bolster dialectics. But entropy really kind of questions that notion, and hence why he kind of really doesn't like it. And slightly later in the publications of the Dialectics of Nature, heat death or entropy is understood as bourgeois reaction. So it's interesting that what you see as that kind of negative moment, or entropy as that negative moment, is something that kind of dialectical materialism really kind of pushes against. It doesn't want, because it sees it as nihilistic. It sees it as something which goes against kind of eternal notion of life that Engels supports. So I just wondered how you would respond to that kind of that reading of Engels' dialectics.
yeah, Pooh, that's a very important and difficult question. I agree. I know indeed the passage about where he discusses the heat death concept, and well, two things I like about my reading of Engels is indeed sympathetic, and because also as a kind of counterpoint to many criticisms of Engels, which are not always, I would say, well-founded, but of course Engels is has his deficiencies as well. But well, two things struck me about his concept. First of all, he tries to make a connection between the discovery of the laws of thermodynamics and, well, the Industrial Revolution. And well, he's not the only one to do that, but well, the laws enabled the Industrial Revolution to unfold, and vice versa. The Industrial Revolution needed this logic about matter and energy to unfold. So this interaction between a real life process, the Industrial Revolution, and technoscientific research, the close connection between the two. I think that was an interesting concept. He may have misunderstood some of the physics in it, but this view I think was important. And what I liked about his concept of negative entropy, life as negative entropy, was, for example, the fact that Erwin Schrödinger later on uses the same term. He doesn't refer to Engels, but it's the same logic. How can life exist if you look at entropy, or if you look at the second law? Life seems something illogical, something impossible. So how can life? So the almost the wonder of life, and of course, Engels doesn't want to mystify it. He tries to come to terms with it. But I quite agree that some of his readings of well, science, he has a very he has a very rough style of writing and reading. Sometimes I like it, but sometimes, yeah, he should have paid more attention to the details. I would agree with that.
Can I respond very quickly?
Sure.
Yes,
No, I agree. I mean, for me, maybe it's less than because I think he's very rigorous when it comes down to the conservation of energy. I personally think, this is just obviously my reading, but it's that there's a purposeful kind of disregard or occlusion of the second law. Even if he really understands it. And I think that's, for me, what's important. And just to respond quickly to the negative entropy, it's this kind of mystery, I think, is still something which, and again, I think of it as a kind of ideological prejudice, because the second law, the kind of what you have to do in order to try and think that life somehow contradicts entropy is to turn entropy into something that talks about order or disorder, order and complexity. And what you're doing there, and this is definitely a kind of relationship between science and technology, is to take metaphor, basically. You're taking something and you're turning it into a metaphor that, we see life as complex, life is ordered. But in order for that ordering to occur, it has to increase entropy. It has to consume entropy. And I know that for me, actually, my completely changing my opinion of this came because I was very much on this idea of life seems to be contradictory, was a book by Dorian Sagan and his work with Lynn Margulis, actually. So this is maybe something interesting for you, called Into the Core, and his work on trying to say that life actually, its kind of principle is actually that it increases in entropy. And that was Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan. So it might be something it changed my opinion completely. So it might do other people's, but there you go. Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Thank you, Joel. Although the co-author is not Lynn Margulis, but Stefan Schneider.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is a very good book, of course, on the entropy of life, because a lot has happened, of course, in the thermodynamics of life since Engels. Thanks, Joel. Our next question is from Roshni Babu, and it's directed at Professor Zwart. One of the predominant spirit of continental philosophy in the sense of reserve, as you mentioned in your talk, is its political potency of uncovering embodied politics and its correlative uncovering of the somatosphere. And he asks, or he asks for your comment. If you want to add something to this, Roshni, you can, of course, come online and mute your microphone. If not, then I'll give the floor to you. Yeah, there's Roshni. Yeah.
Hi, my question is basically coming from this the post-structuralist voice from the quarters of Deleuze, Foucault, etc., who wanted to who responds to this the Hegelian notion of consciousness by turning towards the body, basically, and basically Hegelian consciousness becomes the end of metaphysics in the hands of post-structuralists, mainly for the reason that this consciousness also embodies Eastern thinking. So how do you respond to this post-structuralist turn? I know in the parlance of technoscience, these post-structuralists, especially Deleuze and Foucault, especially in the language of Stiegler, they couldn't accommodate technoscience, the techniques of advanced technologies adequately. But how do you look upon this particular problem?
Yes, thank you very much. Once again, a very fascinating question. Well, a few comments. I'm quite sure I'm not completely answering your question, but a few comments from my side. Well, first of all, I would say, yes, if we think about Hegel, we think about consciousness and self-consciousness, but actually Hegel was a more somatic thinker, so to speak, than we tend to think. There was a lot of body talk in Hegel in various ways. So humans as embodied and nature as an embodied phenomenon, although, well, he wants to will develop a phenomenology of the spirit, of course. There is more, let's say, embodiment in his work than we sometimes acknowledge. At the same time, I do agree, of course, that Foucault and other post-structuralist thinkers have well, of course, been very right in emphasizing, what Heidegger already referred to as mobilization, the mobilization of bodies as a resource. That's well, of course, in Engels, that's already a very important topic. Both the exposure of human bodies to the disruptive impact of labor and environmental pollution on a massive scale, but also indeed the mobilization of human bodies as a workforce, etc. But I absolutely agree that Foucault and other Deleuze and other thinkers absolutely add something when it comes to let's say, the fate of embodiment in the era of capitalism and in the Anthropocene. So I think you evidently have a point there. So I do think that the traditions which I present in my book have something to add to that discussion, but at the same time, yeah, I really acknowledge the added value of the perspectives you are referring to. But for me, it's what I try to move away from is that let's say, to put it simplistically, you're either Deleuze or Hegel or something like that. You're either Marx or Foucault. No, I want to see, and Natalia already mentioned that, I want to see this as one big research program. Yes, within this program, there are many tensions and many contradictions and many collisions, and there is a lot of struggle and a lot of polemics, but at the same time, I think we are all contributing to the same research program in the sense that we try to come to terms with the disruptive turn in global civilization and how, from a philosophical perspective, we can come to terms with that.
Okay, thank you, Huub. We have another question from John Sykes or Sikes. It's rather long, but I'll try to read it. Thank you for the rich and informative presentations. I wondered what you might think on the right of philosophy to comment on the broadest definitions operative in science. I believe Heidegger said something to the effect that psychology, sociology, and biology cannot define the phenomena of psyche, society, or life, as science does not think. Indeed, some philosophers of science have tried to use phenomenology to define life or nature, etc. Empirical science may also update its own regional ontologies on the basis of its discoveries. So there is perhaps a dialectic between a priori definitions of the object of science, for instance, life, mind, matter, and how these definitions are modified either via experimental discovery or philosophical reappraisal. If you want to add something to that, John, you can unmute. Yes.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I don't think I have any comments of clarification. There are some interesting interdisciplinary endeavors, for example, in the cognitive sciences, where things like the body or mind or consciousness are seen as inadequate from older psychological or neuroscientific perspectives, and then people will use phenomenology to kind of update. And it reminds me perhaps of what Husserl said of regional ontologies contributing to other disciplines, or Heidegger's, the quote that I read on sociology won't tell us about the phenomena of society, etc. So, sorry, I know it's a broad question, but in any sense of how you might think about that would be helpful to me. Thank you.
No, for me, it's a very clear question and a very important question. Well, Hegel already, of course, claimed that there is more philosophy in science that scientists are willing to acknowledge. So a kind of implicit metaphysics, which is guiding scientific research. And if you don't make that explicit, so to speak, if you don't reflect on that critically, then this will guide your research in a certain direction without you knowing it. And that's why Hegel, also promoted this science-philosophy dialogue, so to speak, because, this implicit, untested, so to speak, unchallenged metaphysics of technoscience should be brought into the open, should be questioned, and should be explicitly challenged. And I think that you have indeed the same idea in Husserl and Heidegger. Yes, Heidegger does claim that scientists don't think, that they are not themselves able to, for example, in the life sciences, to answer the question, what is life? And I would agree with that. At the same time, I think it's important for philosophers to every now and then enter a laboratory and to have a look at what life sciences researchers are doing, including their implicit metaphysics or ontology, which materializes in their equipment, in their approach, in their methodologies, etc. So in order to make these regional ontologies or these implicit ontologies explicit and to question them, we need this philosophy science dialogue, this mutual exposure. That's so in order to, for example, I work in a project on building a synthetic cell. We talk a lot about what is life. And I think precisely the dialogue between, let's say, the philosophical question and the technoscientific experiences in this project can be very helpful to re-ask this question. It forces us, this development forces us to re-ask the question we already talked about in life as negative entropy, for example. What is life? And what is this philosophy, this guiding idea about life that is guiding synthetic biology, and how to question that implicit answer to the question, what is life? So I hope this is an answer to the question. But I agree that we need this dialogue, this mutual exposure, to come to terms with basic concepts which are guiding science at the moment.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. Is there something published on this idea of a definition of life that includes synthetic life?
Yes, I can share. Send me an email and I'll.
Great. Thank you very much.
Some suggestions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Vincent had some remarks on this question in the chat. Maybe you can want to clarify it, Vincent, or shall I? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I thought it is a nice way to use the chat to continue the discussion, but
of course, yeah.
Yeah. In section 3 of Being in Time, Heidegger is talking about the crisis of the basic concepts of science, and then he argues that philosophers should contribute to that. At the same time, if you read Being in Time and you compare it with his lectures from the 1920s, that's a complete scientific abbreviation of everything he thought. So you shouldn't take Being in Time too serious, as it is. It's a ridiculous book in a way. But I leave that for now. But we have to disagree with Heidegger, because it is not the philosopher who defines the basic concept. It is the scientist that is defining it. Newton and Einstein, they are the ones who define what nature, etc. is, I would say. From our perspective as philosophers, we might have the feeling that we want to contribute to this discussion. And I agree with you, Huub, that it would be great, and that we also do sometimes this type of exercise with scientists. But the reality is also that we don't play a central role, I guess. And I like your work on the oblique perspective, because it enables us as philosophers to engage in a dialogue in a way, on the one hand, but at the same time also acknowledges our distance, the complete disconnection or asymmetry between what we are doing and what they are doing. And that is the whole topic that I wanted to present also in my response to your book, that there is an urgent need to think about identity and difference in a more methodological sense of the word. And in this regard, I was a little bit hesitant to accept that we should be in dialogue with scientists. Maybe Pieter, if I may ask one other question too.
Sure. Yeah.
Because also to challenge you a little bit, I understand you, Huub, that you want to make a program in which you bring together all these different continental philosophical perspectives, while I have the tendency to say the whole dialectics is overestimating identity, and the whole Heidegger-Derrida stream of literature is highlighting the difference or overestimating difference. And I think it is quite difficult. So that's why that was the reason for me always to get rid a little bit of the dialectics. I see, reading your book, also the advantages, but is it not also the case that there is a fundamental clash between these streams of literature, these streams of thinking in the end? And that is also a little bit then questioning your program that is trying to bring everything together. It's a modest question.
No, absolutely, very important question. And yes, we have to dive into this collision and recognize the incompatibility. But at the same time, isn't it time to try to supersede a little bit this section, how do you say, sectarianism in philosophy, where everyone wants to have his own school, etc. Because, well, we can also learn from one another. Yes, I know I'm naive and optimistic, etc. But when I read Hegel and when I read Heidegger, my basic conclusion or my basic mood in the end is always, yeah, they are saying the same thing. I know that can be challenged, but still, that is always my experience. So apologies for that.
And I just want to, if I may contribute to this moment of our discussion, that's why I suggest to look not only at this book as a I would say, a completed and finished project, because I really believe that our discussion also shows that we might think about the whole idea of thinking dialectically and thinking about the continental philosophy in a philosophical way, in a sense that we might think actually whether we really this difference and identity problem, whether we solve it in philosophy, or what could it mean to solve this kind of problem, right? And that is why I believe it is a kind of meta dialectics, actually. But the question is whether we agree that there is a possibility for some sublation in this case, right? So that is why this is so interesting, and that is why I think this book is so inspiring.
I absolutely agree. It's an unfinished program, and hopefully a collective program. Indeed, yeah, it's reaching out to our other authors struggling with the same questions. To let's work together to make this happen, and it's completely unfinished. Absolutely. No, thanks for your response. Yeah, I agree.
Still an unvolended dialectical project. By the way, Vincent, I don't think that Heidegger would agree with you that Einstein and others now define what nature is. Heidegger would not accept, I think, the exclusivity, of course, of the natural sciences to define what nature is. That would be, to subscribe to the Gestalt. But
in Being in Time, he argues that the philosopher should do that. But that's, of course, a ridiculous idea that is not connected with any empirical evidence, I would say, because in reality, he also refers to Einstein. It is not the philosopher that's doing that. It's Einstein himself that is doing that.
Yeah, but Heidegger
but you're right but I agree with you, and I didn't want to make another impression that Heidegger believes in Being in Time, that is the role of the philosopher.
Yeah. That's absolutely the case. It is 2 o'clock, but we still have one question, and I would like to take some time for that, because it's a very interesting one, and that has been posed by Bas de Boer. Maybe Bas wants to add a little bit, but he talks about can you elaborate a bit on how technoscience is capable of investigating the noumenon that you talked about with Bachelard? Does it construct the noumenon, that is to say through mathematics, as Bachelard seems to say, or is there a noumenal structure outside that technoscience somehow has access to? And if so, what does the term noumenon mean still? Yeah, I think this is a very clear question, but if you want to add something, Bas, then you can use your microphone, but I guess it's obvious, the question. Huub?
No, very important question. It will take at least an hour, I think, to discuss it fully. But well, I think, and that's what I try to explain in my book, that Bachelard, but also other people are talking about it, Engels, for example. They say, and especially after 1900, so in the case of Engels, it was more an anticipation, technoscience, this combination of high-tech technologies with advanced mathematics, goes beyond phenomenological nature. It discloses, it opens up, it reveals the noumenal structure in terms of elementary particles, in terms of the elementary particles of life, matter, energy, etc. So not in terms of objects we can see, but well, interestingly, Bachelard uses the term surreal entities. So it's not something you can see or let alone touch or something like that. it's something which you can only study in laboratories under very special conditions, and even then, very often indirectly. But yes, that's his claim that in 20th century science has opened up the noumenal essence, the noumenal dimension, the elementary particles, the elementary building blocks of life and matter, and even enables us to manipulate that, building quantum computing out of marijuana particles, or building synthetic cells and artificial DNA out of nucleotides. Yes, of course you can discuss it, but I find this a very interesting comment on what is so specific about 20th century science. So I would completely agree with Bachelard, but I'm open to discussions about it. It's of course but as you say in your question, the dilemma is of course that you can't study the noumenal outside of technoscience. Only technoscience has access to that noumenal dimension via this combination of advanced mathematics and high-tech equipment. Yeah, that's so only the technoscientists have access to that. So.
Can I very briefly respond?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So thanks you. What I'm struggling with a bit is that it is one thing to say that technoscience constructs and studies what is real or what it takes to be real, and then saying that technoscience studies or constructs the noumenon, I think. And I'm a bit in the dark of what is the distinction between these two claims exactly, or what the term noumenon actually adds to any description of scientific activity.
Well, to put it in Kantian terms, I would say then our nature as we see it, nature as it presents itself to us, is a phenomenon, and technoscience tries to move beyond that phenomenon, tries to open up the noumenal real, the real, which is beyond appearance, beyond the phenomenon, the way nature presents itself to us via our natural senses, and open up to real. But that's in the noumenal sense of the term. So I can imagine that this sounds quite abstract, but that's basically the claim, this basic structure which determines phenomenal nature, but not in a deterministic way, because on the noumenal level, as we all know, nature makes leaps and nature behaves in bizarre ways, in surreal ways. So it's the real, but it's the surreal real, Bachelard would say. So it's the world of elementary particles, which is completely different from the world as we know it. But well, according to technoscientific discourse and practice, we are now able to enter that world via CERN and via our genome sequences and via all these advanced telescopes that claim to be getting closer and closer to the Big Bang and to a universe which existed billions of years ago. So yeah, the surreal real is opened up by technoscience. That's the claim.
Okay, thank you. There is a small debate going on in the chat.
Yeah, there's noumenology. Yeah, that's his. So phenomenology, and Bachelard says that we philosophers have to familiarize ourselves with technoscience, have to come to terms with what we just call the basic metaphysics of technoscience. And so instead of phenomenology, what we actually need is a noumenology. Yeah, right. Yeah, to come to terms with the surreal real, which is being disclosed by science.
Anyone wants to add to that?
Well, it's a very complex issue, of course.
Yeah.
We discuss it much too briefly now, but interesting, fascinating.
There is very interesting. Yes, if Juk or Jochem wants to respond to this or say something, but I don't see that. So okay, yeah, we're already over time, about 8 minutes. So yeah, I want to thank you all very much for this great event, especially Huub, of course, for presenting his book. And then Natalia, thank you very much for your great reading. And Vincent, of course, who already has left us, unfortunately, because he had to lecture. Yeah, I hope you've managed to find new participants or colleagues in the dialectical project. It's a very interesting book, and it's especially for philosophers who are interested in the technosciences and in the life sciences in particular. So I recommend reading it. It's free. It's an open source book. The PDF at least can be got from Routledge, from the website, but it's also nice to have a paper copy. Okay, if there is not anybody who wants to say something, then I want to close it off again by also thanking the audience, by the way, for your very great questions and for your attention. And looking forward to see you again at another moment. Thanks a lot, and
yeah, thanks very much. Thanks.
Thanks again, and bye-bye to everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye. And read Hegel, because everything is in Hegelian philosophy. This is the conclusion of our discussion.
For the Hegelians.
Yeah, absolutely. For the Hegelians, this was a wonderful discussion. So.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed it also a lot, and thank you again for participating.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay,
bye-bye.